Hello, and welcome to Ep.2 of the Sounding Board video series. I'm here with Beth Boucher, and we are going to talk about how to talk to the board, lessons learned, what works, what doesn't, and all those good things. Beth, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. Good day to everyone. Thanks for the opportunity.
So I've known you forever. One of my friends says for donkey's years. I'm not sure where that came from. I don't know why we mentioned donkeys, but I've known you for a really long time. But maybe the people that are watching this might want to know a little bit about you. So can you tell them a little bit about yourself, your background, particularly as it pertains to talking to boards?
Yes, of course. So outside of being an Nemertes research fellow, my pleasure, I have more than 25 years of experience, most recently serving in the roles of SVP and CIO. I've done all my career in technology, leading various global initiatives across multiple industries. I've been in consulting and outsourcing, global merger acquisition, digital transformation, and cyber. So really end to end, from ops to strategy to transformation. I'm also a partner with Fortium Partners, and we provide fractional and interim CIO services to our clients across the US. And then, as it relates to this topic, I'm a partner, I'm a board member, independent board member on both a public and a private board. I'm chair of the nominating and governance committee for both of those boards, and also participate as an audit committee member on one of them.
That's excellent, and I'm smiling because I know we talked about this, and you talked about all the mistakes that you made that led you to having the experience that you now have. But tell us a little bit. I know this is a theme that you're super passionate about. Why
Yeah.
are you particularly passionate about this theme?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I am really passionate about this. There's a couple reasons. The first one is I have the good fortune to sit in both seats. That is to say, I'm a technology executive presenting to boards, and I'm also at the other side of the table as a board member listening to technology executives. And it is painful to me to see the gap in miscommunication, having sit in both of those seats. The second reason is I don't think the stakes have ever been higher, right? I think that post COVID in particular, but just the evolution is technology has moved from a utility and a cost center into a revenue generating, differentiating capability. So the agenda has changed, and that the expectations of the technology agenda at the board level has changed. And,
Well,
and with that in mind, board members are really sensitized to technology. They know they need to understand it. They know it's a big deal. They may not have the language. So that's and then finally, the last thing is presenting to boards, developing content for boards, being a board member, receiving that content takes an extraordinary amount of time. And I like to make sure our time is productive.
yeah, and it's interesting that you highlighted the whole issue of it's all about technology. Technology has moved from being a cost center and a utility function to this whole concept of digital transformation. And
Yeah.
as you were talking, I was thinking, I think there's an element, we focus on the challenges facing cybersecurity and technology executives, but I think there's also an element of the board members that like, oh, this is scary. How am I going to learn what matters in my limited amount of time? I can only rely on the people who are giving me presentations. So there's almost a sort of mutual wariness where each one is almost intimidated by the other a little bit.
True. That's very, very true. And that is the opportunity. It's the opportunity for the technology professional to recognize that and meet them where they live, in their language, in their context, in their background. And so it's there. But the key thing, which is always the hardest part, is your audience interested? Well, they're interested.
Right. That's the big thing that's changed. You can count on them being interested. Well,
Exactly.
last episode, I know we talked a lot about the research that we did that showed that one of the biggest problems that technology professionals and cybersecurity professionals have is translating geek speak to business speak.
Yeah.
I can think immediately of an example in my own background of this, but maybe you have a couple war stories that you're familiar with as well.
I do. I'd like to pick two. So I'll pick one from the perspective of being a board member, and then one that's a little closer to home in my own experience of presenting to a board. So the first one is as a board member, and this was actually from one of my fellow board members, and it came to mind because we're all watching with a weary eye on Hurricane Ian, coming up the coast. And the presentation topic from the technology executive was BCP and DR.
Very
Very
relevant.
important topic,
Yes.
very relevant, very important topic for boards when you think risk, business continuity, of course. The challenge was that this person was a little nervous, didn't know the audience, and launched into RPO and RTO and met with kind of a neutral response. And of course, the challenge was the board didn't understand the language. This person went into details of their backup strategy, and they're just like, okay, but what does it mean? So really, in hindsight, and we provide this feedback, it would have been better for that person to talk about revenue potential, potential loss of revenue, talk about reputational loss, data loss, right? Things like that, as opposed to the more technical view of, RPO, RTO. So that's an example that seems relevant to what we're all looking at today, at least on the East Coast. Now, here's something a little deeper, and I still have scars to show for this. So years ago, I was presenting to a board, and it represented, a year's worth of work, really, with the management and leadership team. It was a comprehensive business transformation. We were very excited about it. It was very thoughtfully done, very thoroughly done. Came in, had the slide, went through, it was end to end, CRM, ERP, data, cloud, just all fired up about it. And I did it in just a few slides, and I was really excited and proud. And then I looked around the room, and it was sort of nonchalant. And I thought, what's happening here? Like, this is big. Like, they should be, jumping out of their seats, either with concern or excitement. And it was sort of like, a couple notes here and there. And I thought, so my time was up, and I went trotting out. And of course, I immediately solicited, and I was fortunate to get some pretty candid feedback from board members that said, we, you made an assumption that we all understand what ERP is, what CRM is, why do we care about data and analytics? So you started at the wrong place. And so we were trying to catch up and sort of absorb that and think about what it meant while you were sort of carrying on the narrative. So it was painful to realize I had missed an opportunity. Worse, I had wasted their time and wasted an opportunity. And I thought to myself, I'm never going to make that mistake again. And that's part of why I have a passion about this.
Well, and my story is pretty similar. When I was, young Turk CTO, I remember bouncing into my CEO's office and telling him all the wonderful things we were doing with our network. And he just looks at me and goes, Johna, I don't care about the freaking network. I want to know what the freaking network will do for me. Except this
Yeah,
was in New York, so he didn't say freaking.
yeah,
And
exactly.
and I remember thinking, oh, he's got an excellent point. And I think that, that was one of the things I realized, that generally, if you're a technology professional, part of the reason you're a technology professional is because you think technology is cool. And
Mhm.
even though it's very, very important, the vast majority of people don't really think technology is cool. It's a thing they have to learn. Maybe they're passionate about something else, finance or golf or business
Right.
strategy. Technology is just the means to an end. And so you can't assume that they're going to be as enthusiastic about the technology as you are.
Sadly,
So
they're not.
yes. Well, we sort of delved into some examples so people can really think about how this sounds in the real world. But
Mm.
what are some of the common themes that you've seen with technology and cybersecurity professionals talking to the board? Mistakes that they made or things, areas they could have been better.
Yeah, and there really is a small set of recurring themes. And if you had a chance or get an opportunity, go ahead and look back at episode 1 that we did on September 14th, and we sort of highlighted these results from our survey. But our results are very consistent, and there's really three key things that are common areas of improvement or mistakes. The first one is too much detail and way too technical, using the tech jargon, unexplained acronyms. And so you've lost the audience already in terms of the content. The second one, equally important, maybe more important, is sometimes the content lacks business context. You have to tie what you're talking about in the context of business, the company vision, the goals, their performance. And you need to understand that you're talking in literally a different language. Think about it as a second language, right? When you approach people who are multilingual differently when you communicate. It's the same concept. And the third thing is, sometimes technology executives come in with an orientation that is too operational and too tactical. Bring it up a level. Go in painting a strategic vision of the business being enabled by technology, not what the cool technology can do.
Yeah, those definitely resonate, and I found personally that one of the things that helps a lot is to encourage people to use constructs, verbal constructs such as, "And because of this, this will happen," or "Therefore," "because, therefore." Causality becomes sketching out that causality is incredibly important. I'm often reminded of a senior technologist that I know who continues to be one of the brightest men alive on the planet. I lost track of how many, how many patents he had at 45. He's got a very, very high level role at a very, very technology centric company. And yet he could never communicate effectively to non-technologists for a very funny reason. He was always afraid of insulting them or feeling like causing them to feel like they were being condescended to. So he would
Yeah,
never connect the dots. He would make
yeah.
a statement and look at you expectantly like you're going to see why this technology that I just talked about, what impact it'll have, because it's obvious. And as one of my
Yeah,
math
you'll
professors
figure it
said,
out.
yeah,
Yeah, you'll well, no, you're smart, you'll figure it out, right?
right, and it's like, no, you really, really have to do people will be grateful for that,
Yeah.
because if you say, "If then," or "because," or something like that, you're not giving them an opening to come back to you with a non-insulting kind of a non-embarrassing, "Okay, I don't really see what that connection is. Can you sketch that out a little bit more? Why is it?
Mhm.
Why is there
Mhm.
this connection?" And then if you're able to do that, I think that's where you're cooking with gas.
And I think
Um,
one of the things that came out of the survey too, to really call to everyone's attention is that active listening. It's a skill. You can learn it, you can practice it. So you have everything set, you've taken all the guidelines, read the room. If they're off, getting a coffee, jotting down, sketching, whatever it is, are they following? And throw out a few things, pull them into the presentation. So test it as you're having the conversation.
that's actually a very, very good recommendation, and that actually was gonna be my next question, which is, are there some sort of common things that technology and cybersecurity professionals can and should be doing during the presentation, that will make it go better?
A couple suggestions. I think the first one I mentioned earlier, but lose your vice grip on the details. It's not about the details. Learn how to be disciplined and abstract your content and summarize it. Go in painting a storyboard in business context and be ready to get your message out in 5 minutes. It's almost always the case that you have less time than allocated. Be ready for that. If you get more, be ready for that too, but be ready. You should really be able to distill it down in a few minutes. The second recommendation is be really explicit and intentional in your presentation. Are you there? Is your intention with the content to educate and inform? Are you looking for consultation? Are you seeking a decision? So, what's on the table? I just want to let you know I really need your help with this. I need to alert you to this, or this really requires decision making on the part of the board. You'd be surprised, but sometimes that's not obvious. As a board member, I'm sort of fishing around, and I will often ask them, is there an action that you would like us to take here? Well, don't make them ask. Anticipate. That's what they want to know. They want to do their job and understand, enable help them do that, enable them to do that. The last thing I think is just as we mentioned before, I'll keep saying it, it's a laser focus on speaking in business terms. Talk about growth, risk, profitability, customer, segmentation, new products, markets, agility, product development. Those are things, speak in the language of the business.
And when you talk about risk, that actually brings to mind another anecdote. I remember several years ago, we were paid a rather ridiculous amount of money to come in and basically decide between, product A and product B and present
Hmm.
that to the CIO.
Okay.
And what was actually funny about it was we did this incredibly detailed test and test capabilities, and we
Down in
got
the
all
minutia, right?
right, we got all the way down to a
Yeah.
capability that essentially was not necessarily relevant in the current configuration of the company, but would become incredibly relevant if they decided to expand globally because it wasn't latency sensitive or
Okay.
latency tolerant.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
basically, if they bought this product, they would have a hard time expanding their infrastructure globally. And, so I went back and said to the CIO, well, dollar wise, they're almost the same. Capability wise, they're almost the same. The big difference between A and B is the risk that you are assuming with B, because B will not necessarily be able to work if your strategy goes that way. And I just
Mhm.
remember him smiling and going, "Oh, risk avoidance. I can quantify the benefit of risk avoidance easily. Thank you very
Yeah.
much."
It's a
And
real tangible that boards gravitate to. It's almost like the safer ground, right? There's a fundamental requirement of good governance, and it's managing risk. Growth, yes, profit, yes, but risk first and foremost. And that right there, gave you your 3 minute or your 5 minute summary. If you only had a minute, here's what you need to know.
exactly. Yeah,
I
and
love
that and that that's actually another thing that I found, just in presenting generally. You may have a set number of slides, and I notice a lot of people just want to go through their pitch on every slide, and they
it.
practice and practice and practice, and they want to deliver the entire pitch. And just a more general principle is you need to have your 5 minute pitch, your 2 minute pitch, and your 30-second pitch for each slide, and mix
That's
and match based on what, as you were saying, the interest of the audience, the time that you have, and all
that's
of
right.
that. And that making that decision on the fly is important.
I
Um,
agree. I agree, and I think to that point, have your content, but also make it clear what's a pre-read, and use that precious time in the boardroom with the whole board, with the in face-to-face dynamic for dialogue. That's a critical opportunity not to be wasted. Don't waste it on slideware.
exactly. That's where you can connect. And now we're sort of drifting into the whole, how do you prepare? And what are,
Right.
I know we have another episode coming up, episode 3, where you're going to talk about how to build that presentation, what to put in it and what not to put in it.
Yes.
But let's talk a little bit about how you should prepare for that board meeting.
I think a few tactical guidelines I'll share, and we'll talk more about this. The first one is know your audience. So you should not walk into that room and not know who's going to be there, what's on the agenda, what's their background. Study your board members, study their history. What committees have they been a part of? What presentations have they done? What organizations are they from? What industry knowledge do they? What technology knowledge do they have? You should never go into that conversation with a blank slate, just waiting to see what happens. Study them, make the time, make the investment. In addition to that, if you have a culture that supports this, get to know them. Have an intro meeting between board meetings. Have a coffee, virtually or otherwise, and start to realize how they want to engage, what their language is, and also solicit feedback. What's top of mind for you? What do you think is most important that you would like to know more about, that the board is concerned about? And it doesn't have to be technology. So those are all opportunities that are there for your taking if you engineer them in. And I suggest that you do, because it's going to be very effective for you, for your management team, and for the board. I think the second recommendation I would have is, walk in when before you go in, understand the macro performance, right? It's not about you, it's not about technology. How is the company doing? What's the latest news release? What's the latest performance, financial performance? What else is on the board agenda? Because sometimes there have been situations where the content was just pushed aside. A good example, for example, is one time I was presenting something that was a really had been an urgent topic for the board, but it was completely overshadowed by a surprise acquisition move. And so I was on the agenda, but they were not. They were just like, let's just get this over with, because we've really got to get to this executive session. So you have to know your context, and you can get that from the board agenda. You can get that from the CEO or the chair. Know the context. And
Yeah.
then the
Oh,
last
go ahead.
one, I'm sorry, go
No,
ahead.
no, go ahead.
The last one I mentioned earlier, which is make it a dialogue. You want them to sort of put the slide aside, and you want them to pay attention to you. You want to be able to have that eyeball connection, and see, are you connecting? Are they understanding? Do they invite questions? Get away from the slides. Have a discussion.
Absolutely. Connect, I think, is what, it
Yeah.
distills down into. Well, it's funny, when you and I talked about this earlier, I thought about the fact that technologists and cybersecurity professionals tend to be some of the smartest people on the planet, but they do have a big blind spot. And I was thinking a CIO is most likely to prep for this meeting. His or her greatest fear is that there's some technology, they'll be asked about some technology, and they don't understand it all the way down to the deepest nuance,
Yeah.
because you
Yeah.
can't if you're an effective CIO. And so
Yes.
they'll spend nights, coming up to speed on details of development methodologies and infrastructure, but they won't think about who the humans are in that meeting. And CTOs are kind of the other end of the spectrum, and I know I am one. We kind of think, there's no technology that I won't have an
I'm
opinion
going
on.
to know this.
I
Yeah.
can I can do this. But we also don't stop and think, hey, who am I going to be meeting with? Let me
Yeah.
understand what they're concerned about. So I think that's a really, really valuable piece of guidance.
It's been very helpful, and I think everyone in the room appreciates it. It just, it's one of those keys to effective communication, regardless of the context. But if you don't think about it, it's your loss, right? It's one less tool in your toolbox to make it productive and effective.
Well, so I've asked you a bunch of questions. That was the model here. What did I not ask you that I should have?
I was a little surprised that you didn't ask me, how do I get funding approved?
Interesting. Okay.
So, a lot of times the agenda is you're going to come in, you're going to ask for money. We need this investment to do this big transformation or to invest in our cybersecurity maturity, whatever the case is. It's often that there's an ask, and it's often that it's associated with funding. And what I would say to that is, similar to what we talked about before, which is first of all, paint a vision and a storyboard before you get into any numbers. And that vision has to be, again, quantitative, qualitative, in the context of business performance. We keep saying that. Put everything in the currency of the board and be really transparent about the risks and concerns that you have, right? Don't hide things from the board. Now make sure you tie this off with your leadership and management team ahead of time, but the board is there to help, and they're there to govern, and they share in the risks of these things not going well. So be transparent, especially now, with the rate and pace of technology. There's a lot of risk for these implementations. Be open about that. Engage them and
Yeah.
ask for help.
Well, and it's interesting when you say how do you ask for money? I think you're right. You paint without necessarily numbers, you paint the vision of what might be done with this funding. And then I think the other piece is you really want to sanity check and level set that this is not an unreasonable ask in the context
Mhm.
of the company's organization, their view. One of the things we like to do with companies is ask IT people to position a company's what we call IT culture for us. And at one end of the
Mhm.
spectrum is aggressive. And these are companies
Yeah.
that in their DNA, they understand that technology is a competitive advantage and strategic investment. And you have a totally different conversation with somebody who's aggressive or bleeding edge than you do with someone who's conservative or moderate and sees
That's right.
technology really as a cost saver. You have a different pitch. So if you know loosely the culture, you can actually have a much more meaningful conversation about why they should fund something.
I agree with you. It's, context, 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 right? If you're coming in with a cybersecurity plan and it's on the heels of a security event, that's a very different conversation than we're going to be proactive and here's why and here's what that means. So, it's really about the context and knowing that ahead of time.
Excellent. Well, I think that does it for what we wanted to talk about. I just want to remind everybody, in addition to the episode that's already out with our research findings, we also have our next episode, which is on October 12th at noon Eastern. And that's where we get into the fundamentals and the details of what to say and what not to say. And that'll be Beth and Jerry Murphy from our team talking about both what works and what they found doesn't always work. And we
Hmm.
all have made mistakes, so you don't have to.
Yeah. Thanks, Johna. Appreciate the time today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Beth. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in and listening to this. We will talk to you again in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, everyone.